It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative peer Danny Finkelstein, Labour MP Richard Bergen, the editor of the Yorkshire Evening Post, Laura Collins, and economics correspondent at The Spectator, Kate Andrews. Coming up in the programme, Boris Johnson meets Joe Biden at the White House, but the president plays down the prospect of a free trade deal.
On the deal with the UK, that's continued to be discussed.
Also, the gas crisis. The government defends bailing out some parts of industry.
It's been something of a perfect storm, a set of exceptional events, and that's why this short-term limited intervention is justified in this instance.
With the Prime Minister in America, Dominic Raab will stand in for him at Prime Minister's Questions with Angela Rayner for Labour. And a rows brewing ahead of Labour's party conference this weekend. Meanwhile, the new leader of the Unite union won't be going.
I should be out with my members, particularly at this juncture, particularly when they are in crisis.
Let's start with the bailout. You heard George Eustice there, Cabinet Minister, in the headlines. This is a different headline in the Times newspaper covering the story. Government interventions in the carbon dioxide and energy markets are likely to be the tip of a large iceberg as more sectors clamour for taxpayers' money. This is a story that ministers announced after reaching a deal last night to pay tens of millions of pounds to a US fertiliser firm to shore up carbon dioxide supplies in the face of shortages. It's said to last at least 3 weeks, short term, says the government, and they claim the move will guard against food shortages and protect the UK's 6 advanced gas-cooled nuclear reactors. My question to the panel is the government intervention to bail out this company justified? Danny.
Yeah, I think it is. Look, my paper, The Times, this morning has made it clear that we are concerned about a rising tax, rising subsidy economy. But you have to be pragmatic about these things. We need to look afterwards at whether we're regulating our industry properly, whether we're ensuring enough competition, and why it was that businesses haven't done what the soft drinks industry has done when they had this crisis previously and begun to put in some redundancy for exactly this sort of event. So there are real questions to be asked, but I don't think there's any question it was necessary to do what was done.
Richard, was it justified?
It's necessary what the government's done, and it throws into light the whole question of state intervention, because it was popular for a long time to say that state intervention, state support had no role to play. In this case, it's necessary. We've seen it through the pandemic, but more broadly, where state intervention occurs, it should come with conditions when it comes to bailing out companies, conditions in relation to the environment, conditions in relation to workers' rights, conditions in relation to the paying of taxation, for example, but also we want the state to play a positive role, for example, in Northern Investment Bank, investment banks national in other parts of the country, to create the green jobs of the future in areas like my own.
All right. Kate, what about for you? Is it justified? The government says it's a short-term temporary fix.
Yeah, we found ourselves in the midst of an energy crisis, but unlike the pandemic, which was a crisis that started on the other side of the world that we had essentially no control over, this is a crisis of the government's making. Between energy price caps, which have completely failed, to lots of subsidy going into the industry, the government has put itself in this very vulnerable situation, not to mention the fact that it doesn't have enough gas reserves. So I agree that it's probably necessary now, but I don't think we can compare this to COVID-19. We should point the finger at the state, look at all the areas that intervention's already gone wrong, and ask how we can fix that in the future so taxpayers don't have to fix the mistakes made by government.
Laura, where are you? Because further bailouts haven't been ruled out by government at this stage.
What we're heading for really is that perfect storm in making sure we've got the right infrastructure in place. You know, it's about making sure the supermarket shelves are stocked. It's warding off that shortage of lorry drivers, and it's making sure that there's enough gas for people's homes. And I think if we look at it long and hard, there appears to have been not enough joined up thinking from the government on this. You know, if the energy, food, transport and business ministers were all working together, then they could have foreseen these issues. So while this is just a temporary solution, ultimately there needs to be joined up thinking on this, and the industry as a whole needs to pull its socks up to look at the supply chain, where the government doesn't want to panic readers, but readers want assurances that ministers are focusing on this and showing that they are on the side of those hardest hit.
Before we move on, Danny, do you think 3 weeks will be enough to actually sort this issue out?
Certainly wouldn't come to me to answer that question. I'm reliant entirely on what the ministers said, what the industry says, what we've written in my own newspaper. I don't have any independent source. So usually the experience of human beings is if they say something will last 3 weeks, it'll last longer than that. You'll spend more money on things, it'll go longer. But that's no more than the kind of instinct of the normal human being rather than any inside knowledge.
Right. I mean, Richard, how long would you like these sorts of interventions to continue for?
Well, it's a necessary intervention, and the government needs to intervene to protect people.
Yeah. For how long?
As long as is necessary.
Yeah.
But
well, yes, but no one knows how long that is it? I mean, do you want this to be a sort of permanent state of affairs?
Well, I'm not proposing that a carbon dioxide plant is taken into public ownership, but more widely, I think gas, energy and water, for example, need to be in public ownership so they can put delivering for people in our country first, not the profits of shareholders.
All right, well, let's cover the story in America because that's where the Prime Minister is. Boris Johnson's visit to the United States. He held talks. You saw the pictures at the beginning of the programme with Joe Biden in the White House last night. Now, they've been discussing a number of issues, as you would expect, including Afghanistan following the botched withdrawal and Northern Ireland, a topic that's very close to Joe Biden's heart. Downing Street is claiming one big win with the headline announcement that the US president has pledged to double annual US funds for helping developing countries tackle climate change, and that will amount to more than $11 billion a year, and that China's president has also pledged not to build any more coal-fired power stations abroad. We're going to talk about some of the substance in just a moment, particularly the climate announcements later on in the programme. But Danny, just stepping back, how big a moment is this for a UK Prime Minister to get a visit like this, to see Joe Biden to the White House? How important are the optics? Well,
it would be surprising if a British Prime Minister was not able to see the President. I don't think we've had anything that's been that surprising. I was a bit surprised by the UK-Australia US security deal. I thought that was very significant. The other things have been broadly what you would anticipate. I thought it was, overstated to suggest that when Donald Trump left and Joe Biden came, our relationship with the United States would fall apart. On the other hand, this doesn't suggest these kind of relationships like we've had with, Kennedy and Macmillan and Blair and Bush, where you've got a cross-party coalition which is particularly close. So I think it's good but completely standard would be how I'd describe it.
Except, of course, the Prime Minister hasn't made any progress, it seems, on a UK-US trade deal. Let's just show everybody the Guardian headline. No deal. PM's hopes of securing trade pact with Biden in disarray. I mean, that's a huge blow, isn't it, Danny, to the Prime Minister's key foreign policy pledge post-Brexit?
I mean, it's not a big surprise to me. I never thought that was...
Well, not a surprise, but how big a blow?
Well, if it's a blow to his own structure of thinking, which I don't completely share on this. I'm not surprised that we are not making much progress, and if we did make much progress, I don't think it would be hugely economically impactful. So I've never put a lot of store by it. But I didn't think it was very likely under Trump he would deliver anything we wanted or that it would get through Congress. And I thought that when Biden took over, what Obama said during the referendum campaign would be correct, that it wouldn't be the priority of the United States because we're not a big enough market. I don't think the case for Brexit stands or falls on that, but it's certainly part of the argument. And I'm certainly not surprised by this. And if it's a blow, well, it's a blow that's entirely to be expected.
Do you agree with that, Kate?
Well, not quite. I don't think we're in disarray territory. I actually didn't think that the comments from President Joe Biden were all that damning to the prospect of a trade deal one day. It's clearly not the top of anybody's priority list, but frankly, it's no longer at the top of the Prime Minister's list either. I think if you look at what Boris Johnson really wanted to get out of this week, he's been very successful. He wants all the focus to be on COP26, which is under 6 weeks' time. He's gotten Joe Biden to go to Congress to try to double the amount of funds they're going to dedicate to vulnerable countries and developing countries in order to help them with their climate agenda. He's getting his platform on the world stage to talk about what Glasgow is going to be like and all that the UK is going to do, leading the way with his environmental agenda. The irony, of course, is that we're talking here about food supply shortages and potential lack of because of our energy agenda, but that seems to more or less have gone overlooked in New York. So I think as far as the Prime Minister is concerned, it will have been a success. Of course, you also have to look at the other failures who came out of this week badly. And it wasn't the UK, it was quite clearly France when we're looking at that trilateral security agreement between Australia, the UK, and the US. France feels blindsided. So it's difficult to say that the UK was the loser this week when there's quite a clear loser on the table, and it wasn't Boris Johnson.
Richard, you were never keen on the type of trade deal that was being proposed by Boris Johnson and discussed with President Trump. Are you pleased the talks appear to have stalled?
Well, I'm not pleased because I want a position that's good for our economy.
So you do want a UK-US trade deal?
Boris Johnson was asked in Parliament the other week, name somewhere in the world, is there anywhere in the world where we have more influence now than we did 2 years ago? His answer was everywhere, which is just delusional. It's clear that we're very much towards the back of the queue when it comes to trade with the United States. We're talking about now trying to bolt the UK on to NAFTA, which was created obviously for the US, Mexico and Canada. So that's not a bespoke trade deal for us, it's adding ourselves to a trade deal that already exists.
Are you saying that's not good news?
I think Bernie Sanders was correct to speak out against NAFTA in the United States because it had a tremendously bad effect on manufacturing jobs in the United States. And then, of course, we've had Biden quite correctly warning the Prime Minister about the effects of his actions in relation to the Good Friday Agreement.
I didn't support Brexit, but I don't have a problem answering the question, where is Britain's influence greater than it was before Brexit? The answer is Britain. And the purpose of Brexit was to restore the right of Britain to be able to make its own laws without having to have the agreement of all the other countries in Europe. My view was that the benefits of that will be abstract and the costs of it will be concrete, and I was therefore against it. But it's clear what the case for it was, and it's not about our influence in the United States or our influence in France. It's about the influence of the British government over British laws.
But the Prime Minister has gone around raising people's hopes. It'd be really, really easy to get all these fantastic trade deals. And it's all a bit Donald Trump, really. It hasn't materialised. It's not as easy as he made out. And we're left with just rhetoric from the Prime Minister about our role in the world. And I am very concerned as well about the prospects of a new Cold War and this security arrangement with Australia and the United States.
Why do you see that as a new Cold War?
Because I think it's ratcheting things up unnecessarily. It's going to drain...
Against China?
Yeah, it's going to drain resources from our country that could be better spent on people's living standards here. And also, whilst obviously we have disagreements with all sorts of countries around the world, including China, we need to be cooperating in relation to poverty reduction, COVID, in relation to climate change. And so I'm worried that it ratchets things up.
Right. I mean, Kate, can I get your reaction, first of all, to the consideration for the UK government, who might try and join this existing trade agreement that Richard has spoken about with the US, Canada and Mexico? Is that enough to deliver global Britain?
Well, look, Richard was talking about how we've been promising the British people lots of trade deals and the government hasn't delivered. Liz Truss, who's now moved to Foreign Secretary, but in her previous 2 years in trade was delivering trade deals left, right and centre.
Yeah, but although how much did they amount to? In terms of replacing the trade that obviously those on the other side of the argument would say are lost by leaving the EU.
But it's not lost. We're talking about win-win. The European Union is still desperate to trade with the UK and vice versa. But the point is that we're now in an easier and faster position to be able to secure trade deals elsewhere. I mean, these are the win-win benefits of free trade. If you have any sense about you want to make it easier for your customers to buy goods abroad and to be able to export your goods abroad as well. And we're working with countries, including the European Union, that I think do have a fundamental grasp of that. And frankly, I think the idea of the UK joining the US, Canada, Mexico newly negotiated trade agreement with low tariffs would be a fantastic thing for UK consumers and probably an easier way into that US trade deal, because fundamentally those disagreements on agriculture between the US and the UK are going to be really difficult to overcome. But if there's another way to go about this, I think that would be really, really positive. Look, in terms of China, we're not talking about ratcheting up, disagreements or aggression. We're talking about a new world in which we have seen things change so fast on the geopolitical sphere over the past year. And when we talk about negotiating and interacting with China, we need to be really clear about what those red lines are. I mean, this is a country that is currently basically undergoing genocide against the Uyghur Muslim population over there. We cannot have rose-tinted glasses when it comes to China and the activity against their own people, let alone threats to the world that we've seen this year. So let's be very clear about what those red lines are. And I think Australia, the UK, and the US dedicating resources to prop up their own defence and to support each other is probably a good thing.
All right. I mean, Laura, what about for your readers, especially those in Leave voting areas? I mean, is it important to them that the government secures these trade deals, particularly the one they talked so much about with Donald Trump, this standalone US-UK trade deal?
Look, I think ultimately we're 5 years on from the referendum now, and certainly the feeling that I get every day in my letters page is that readers are growing increasingly frustrated that this is still continuing to dominate the agenda and remains all-consuming. You know, when I look at what the big issues are for my readers right here in Leeds, you know, this week, the issue that matters most to them is how are they going to pay their heating bills? And you know, ultimately, we should be talking about those opportunities for global cooperation on things like energy security. I think, you know, there's always going to be disagreements, but ultimately there needs to be that constructive dialogue.
Danny, just to pick up on something Richard said, ratcheting up in what he described as the new Cold War. Do you see it like that, this security alliance signed between Australia, UK and US? Do you think there's a danger of it?
No, I mean, this you have to understand. Richard's perspective is he sort of opposed the last Cold War, and I thought the last Cold War was merited. And so we have a difference of opinion about how you deal with these kind of international differences, partly cited in how big we think the moral gap is between the Chinese government and the British government. If you think the capitalism is evil and there's not that much of a difference between being under a capitalist regime or being under kind of Chinese socialist nationalism, then you don't obviously think it's merited to create an alliance in order to counterpose one against the other. But I see the world differently. So we just come up, you know, our entire worldview is locked behind the answer to this question.
I think that's a very kind of theatrical.
But is it true? But is it true?
That wasn't intentional. So you please explain it.
Well, and of course, I was only born in 1980, so I don't have many public pronouncements on the original Cold War. But I'll just ask this question. What would happen? And just imagine if China was placing nuclear-powered submarines sailing through waters near to us, because that's what's happening the other way around. And so I think that we need to be thinking, we have big disagreements with the countries. China needs to do more in relation to climate change.
And how would you go? How would you go about persuading them?
Well, it's about not ratcheting it up. We can't. A new Cold War
what's the alternative?
Is not
what's the alternative
helpful.
if you're not?
Well, we need to show moral leadership. We need to negotiate with these countries and work together on points of agreement on climate. At the end of the day, the leader of China, the leader of the United States, the leader of the UK and other countries are meeting to thrash out deals on climate change. And we need to have those discussions and we need to take things forward. And I do worry that the security deal announced, obviously it's offended France as well, but it's also a huge drain on our national resources when we can see that poverty scars our country. All right. So we can't afford to keep universal credit, the £20 uplift, but we can afford this enterprise.
We're going to talk about cost of living issues in just a moment. Before we do, it is the Labour Party conference starting on Saturday this weekend. It is, of course, the big annual shindig of the party faithful, MPs and the unions. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, will obviously want to use it as a platform to set out his stall. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Ian Watson, because he has done the first broadcast interview with Sharon Graham, the new General Secretary of the very powerful Unite Union. Now, as we said earlier in the programme, she's not attending. I'm just, Ian, going to show everyone this headline. Sharon Graham, Unite leader, to skip Labour conference. Why, Ian?
Well, she's skipping Labour conference, she says, because she's less than a month in the job as the Unite General Secretary, taking over from Len McCluskey, who was, of course, ubiquitous at Labour conferences, very influential, especially during the Jeremy Corbyn era. But she says, less than a month in the job, she has got other priorities. There are 16 industrial disputes that her union is involved in, ranging from Tesco drivers to locksmiths in Wolverhampton, and she's going to be spending the next week travelling the country, as she says, being with her members, putting the workers first. And her advice when she met Keir Starmer on Monday for their first meeting was that he should be speaking out more in favour of workers' rights as well. So she says that's why she's not going. Of course, her union delegates will be there. They'll still be voting on some of the key issues. She stood on a platform that said, basically, let's take the union back to the workplace and away from Westminster. So this embellishes that brand, if you like. But equally, she says that sometimes Westminster is come looking for her, that issues have been thrown over her fence. So, for example, the rule changes that have been proposed by the Labour leadership. Keir Starmer did not give her a heads up on that when she spoke to him on Monday. He's meeting trade unions this afternoon to try to get them to agree to changing the leadership rules, going back to an electoral college, ending one member, one vote. But she has spoken out on that issue, and she told me that talking about rule changes at the conference rather than cost of living is like white noise to her members, but she will oppose any attempt to dilute the membership's say.
Right. Is this a fight that Keir Starmer wants to have, the Labour leader, over changing the rules, giving more say to MPs as they used to have, and reducing the power of members in that vote?
Yes, it is. I mean, this is a political choice for Keir Starmer. What he's got to do, of course, is to try to reconnect with the country. I'm told that, in his own speech at the end of Labour conference, about a week from now, he's going to be very much suggesting that he's in the mainstream of British thinking, that his values, Labour's values, are very much in touch with the values of the British people. In other words, reaching out beyond the conference to try to win people over who are sceptical about voting at Labour. But the first couple of days of that conference may well be entirely overshadowed by internal disputes, because he has chosen to try to change the leadership rules. He hasn't done a great deal of the groundwork. The unions account for 50% of the votes at Labour conference, and that's why this afternoon's meeting with the unions behind closed doors is so crucial, because he needs to get 2 or 3 of them on board. Otherwise, he will set himself up for failure. He will effectively say, look, I want to change the rules, I want to move away from the Corbyn era, but he'll be advertising his inability to do so. So it's a high-wire act for Keir Starmer. What he would say, and his allies would say, is that they need to change this voting system for the Labour leader to give unions more say, as well as MPs more say, because they believe they are more in touch with working people generally, people who don't sign up to political parties, who aren't necessarily active in political parties. And if Labour is going to look outwards again, then it has to appeal to them rather than simply to its own activists.
Right. Ian Watson, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to speak to the Labour MP Neil Coyle, who does support the change in the way Labour leaders should be elected. Richard Bergen here, unsurprisingly, doesn't support it. Why not, Richard?
I think it makes us look hopelessly out of touch. There's a huge living standards crisis in the country. Obviously, I'm speaking all the time, as all MPs are, to hundreds of constituents. Not one constituent during this crisis has said, do you know what we need? We need a rule change to ensure that when Keir Starmer disappears, MPs have more power than before in deciding who the next leader is. It makes us look irrelevant and out of touch, and it doesn't help us to win an election. And I ask myself this question: why is Keir fixated on changing the rules by which his replacement will be elected? He was elected under these rules. Why are we going to Labour Party conference talking about how Keir Starmer's replacement will be elected?
Well, let's put that to Neil Coyle.
Well, the rule change is very simple. We've lost 4 general elections, the last one completely disastrously, and we need to revert back to a system that allows greater openness, greater transparency. I think there's lots and lots of union members who don't have the disposable income to join a political party who will benefit from the extension of union representation through the Electoral College. So we're reverting to a system that helped us win before by picking a better leader. And we absolutely have to be laser focused on that. But where Richard is right is that members of the party and members of the public aren't really talking about this. They do want us to focus on these issues, which is why Richard and others should be supporting these simple constitutional changes early on in conference so that we can get onto the full agenda of attacking the hollowness of the global Britain, which has been exposed by no trade deal with the US, or the hollowness of the levelling up agenda when they're cutting universal credit and raising working people's tax. We can do those policy issues, and we can actually change those policy issues in government if we have a system that allows us to pick a leader that can win.
Right. Richard?
Well, it's also completely anti-democratic. The other week I was talking to...
Why is it anti-democratic?
Let me explain. I was talking to a bloke called Paul, who lives in East Leeds, former factory worker. He's retired. He spends a lot of his time volunteering for the Labour Party, delivered leaflets day in, day out, all weathers. under all leaders, by the way, under the system that Keir is proposing, when it comes to the next leadership election, it's equivalent of him having 1 vote and me having the equivalent of 2,000 of his ballot papers. I don't think that Neil or myself should have 2,000 times the say of our party activists who helped to get Neil elected, helped to get me elected, and can help us to get Labour into government.
Neil?
Well, as I say, no party members are banging on my door saying, oh, what's going on here? They're just not interested in this. And they do elect us. Our members select us where they were allowed to. Under the last leadership, don't forget, there were lots of people just, family and friends influenced and got them shortlisted or parachuted in. So, where they're allowed to select and elect us, they send us here to represent their interests and make sure we do a good job. We're not sheep. We are leaders. We are supposed to actually influence the shape of our party and make sure that we're picking someone who can win. So your mate Paul up in Leeds, he needs you to pick someone who can actually win for us and not another loser on an epic scale like we had before. We do need to have a system that allows us to empower a more positive and more open leadership that is focused on the public and not this silliness within the party. As I say, no member of the public and no members of the party are banging on my door raising this issue. We just need to get through these tiny constitutional changes at conference, which we do at every conference, so that we can get onto the policy agenda and Labour's positive vision for the future of our country.
Richard?
I think it's crazy that Neil and I, when we're on Politics Live today, are discussing this arcane, crazy issue. Keir has chosen to try and rush this through. It wasn't announced before this week. It's starting to define the conference. We need to be setting out a vision. People aren't clear what the Labour Party's position is on a wealth tax. We need to be clear about what our position is. And also, I think it is disingenuous to say it empowers trade unionists. The case is that 1/3 of the votes will go to trade union members, and each MP will have the vote of thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of trade union members. So it's not empowering trade unionists at all.
So what are you going to do about it?
Empowering MPs.
What are you going to do about it, Richard?
Well, I think we need to oppose it. Keir needs to think again. And why is he so fixated on deciding by what method his replacement will be chosen? It's very strange indeed. And I think he could end up digging his own political grave on this. I think it's very, very strange indeed.
Is he digging his own political grave, Neil?
No, and I don't think Richard understands us if he can't see that unions get an enhanced share of the, working people get an enhanced share of the electoral college under this system. But
well, maybe the union leaders don't understand the rules either, because some of them have objected to this.
We need to be laser focused on the people of this country who want to hear that message. So if Richard doesn't want this to overshadow conference, he can vote for the measures and we can all move forward.
I mean, there are two questions. I mean, first of all, Richard, do you accept that it didn't work well when Jeremy Corbyn was leader not to enjoy the support of the parliamentary party and MPs, did it?
Well, MPs should have respected the democratic choice of the whole movement of which they are part.
Keir Starmer's.
What was that, Neil?
Keir Starmer was elected majority of members' votes, so don't be a hypocrite on this. There are too many people who say respect the leader's mandate. Well, respect Keir Starmer's mandate. He's got a mandate to lead. Let's get on with it.
Keir was elected under the current system that he now seeks to change. Keir has no mandate to do this. Keir said in his leadership election programme,
you should only respect the mandate of the leader you liked and not the leader you didn't want. Some people in our party are irreconcilable with the current leadership and they need to get a life and move on.
Keir Starmer said he would empower members in our party. Yes. He had 10 pledges. He needs to revisit those pledges.
And that's the commitment, isn't it, Neil? What about disenfranchising all those members that came into the party under Jeremy Corbyn? Well, it is reducing their influence and impact within the party under a reversion to those old rules, under some sort of electoral college. What about those members? Is it because you're worried that they would support in future a more left-wing candidate than Keir Starmer?
Our members are desperate for Labour to be able to win. Our members are not up in arms about this. There is a tiny faction who are very vocal, probably very lively on Twitter, where they think they're important and relevant, but they don't represent the majority of members, as we saw in the deputy leadership election, for Keir. So things have moved on. Some people seem to fail to keep up with the fact that things have moved on. And the public are desperate for here to talk about the antisocial behaviour epidemic that's after 10 years of the Tories in government. We can talk about that agenda. But unless we have a leader who can win, we can't transform people's lives for the better. But our conference should be a really
let Richard respond, and then I
focus on
must
that.
open it up to my other guests. Richard.
But surely, Neil, you believe we already have a leader that can win, who was selected to be leader under the current system. If you're saying that in order to get a leader that can win, we need to change the electoral system, it doesn't make sense. We want Labour to get into Downing Street.
All right.
This is a distraction. No one's asking for it. It's anti-democratic, and it's breaking promises that Keir made to the members to get elected.
All right, Laura.
He's treating members with contempt.
All right.
It's not right.
Neil, I'm going to say goodbye to you at this point and bring in our other guests. Laura, what's your response listening to this debate?
Well, I find it rather curious that ahead of the conference, you know, we appear to debate the internal leadership elections here, when actually we should be fully focusing on coming up with strong policies that reflect what's happening right here in the country. You know, the Labour leader should be trying to convince the country that he is a strong leader and a strong, credible opposition to the government. I mean, you only have to look at what happened right here in Yorkshire at the last general election. You know, swathes of the county that were traditional red seats turned blue for the first time in decades. And ultimately, the electorate felt disillusioned and decided to vote with their feet. So really, it's about time to cut the squabbling and focus on what needs to be done to win back the trust of those voters in what were traditional red wall seats.
Danny?
It's a bit baffling. I mean, this is the Electoral College was the left's political solution. It was Jack Jones's idea that the Labour Party should have
the old system.
The old system, the system to which Keir Starmer is trying to return, and the right proposed one member, one vote, which the left opposes. And now you've both changed your position and are arguing against each other with the same vehemence as you were at the argument in the first place. So for people outside the party, it's completely baffling. I'm with Richard about that. I do not understand why he's raised this issue, what he's trying to signal. He is the leader under the current system, so is he saying he can't win an election? If he's saying he can win an election, then the electoral system he's got has produced somebody who can win an election. And by the way, Neil said, you know, they lost 4 times under the current system. They lost 3 times under the Electoral College system. So, it was only Tony Blair that interrupted that. So this whole argument is pretty baffling to me, and I think it represents sort of a far deeper crisis in the Labour Party than will be solved by changing these rules.
I think it makes it look completely out of touch. And it wasn't the left who said that the Electoral College was an ideal system in the early 80s. That was because before that was introduced by Tony Benn and the Campaign for Labour Party and Democracy and others, it was only MPs.
No, Labour opposed OMOV. Labour opposed one member, left opposed one member, one vote in 1980 when David Owen proposed it.
But it was a move in the right direction at the time because it weakened the group of MPs. But my main concern, as well as it being anti-democratic, is that it makes Labour and Keir look completely out of touch with the needs of ordinary people. That won't help us to win an election.
Will supporting Keir Starmer do that instead?
Well, we need to get him into Downing Street, and we need to get Labour into Downing Street. But he needs to show that he's fulfilling his promises to our members. Now he needs to think again. All
right. Well, Laura earlier raised the issues of cost of living for her readers. Let's just show you the front page of the Yorkshire Evening Post. You can see it there, very stark. Don't make us choose between heating or eating, which is the choice they say could happen to many people in Yorkshire this winter. Laura, tell us a little bit about the campaign.
So let's make no bones about this. We are facing a winter crisis. We're looking at almost this perfect storm between the hike in energy prices, the plan to cut universal credit, and let's not forget as well, we've got furlough coming to an end soon. You know, there's new figures that show that nearly 500,000 people are going to be hit by the universal credit cuts alone in Yorkshire. And that's doubled from March 2020 when the pandemic hit. There's millions of families living in fuel poverty. And Yorkshire in particular has some of those highest levels where they're going to see that severe impact. So for many families, you know, that extra £20 a week is going to be a difference between whether they can put food on the table or whether they can heat their homes this winter. And quite frankly, that is not a choice that families should be forced to make. So we've launched a campaign which really aims to pile pressure on the government to ensure that no vulnerable families find themselves with this stark choice over the winter. And, you know, let's not forget, this just isn't going to be about the impact in people's pockets as well. It's also that long-term toll on health and well-being as families do face that mounting pressure. You know, ultimately, our vulnerable are going to need more help than ever to stay warm this winter.
I mean, Danny, are you comfortable with what the prospect for the people that Laura is talking about? High energy prices, high inflation, increased taxes, the scrapping of the £20 increase to universal credit, and the list goes on.
So no, am I comfortable with it? Of course not. But we all do have to ask ourselves as a country a question. Can we afford to continue indefinitely the sort of costs we've incurred during COVID to help people through that crisis? And do we want the sort of economy in which we put so much money into transfer incomes and we then end up having less that we can use in the productive economy and the exchange economy? And it's a choice. And a lot of the time, we make the choice, as we've done with social care and we've done with the NHS, to increase. But I could list you loads of things which we'd like to spend money on, which will have problems if we don't spend money on it. And at the end, I can reach 100% of our income, I promised you, by the end of the programme. And, we've already discussed a couple of issues, subsidies and this, in one programme, in which we'd all look round and say, well, that would be a good thing to spend money on. So it's not that I'm comfortable about the situation, but we just have to think about how we're going to balance our costs and our taxes.
Right, before I come to you, Richard, Kate, do you think the government's got that balance right?
Well, in general, no. I think we're probably still spending far too much of taxpayer money, and the tax burden is now estimated to be at a near 70-year high. So I don't think the balance is right. I think we need to go even further in the taxpayers' direction. But look, I think if you want to make the case that the universal credit uplift needs to stay, if you want to make the case for more subsidy, you have to make it outside of the context of the pandemic. You have to cost it. You have to say where the money is going to come from. You have to say why this is at the top of the list. And I think you can make those arguments if you want to for universal credit. But you actually have to do it. To simply say that the crazy 18 months that we've lived through just need to continue and we need to keep spending like that is simply not an option. Laura talked about inflation there. Well, inflation is going to hit your average consumer, your average person. It's also going to hit the government's spreadsheets. And it's going to become increasingly difficult for us to borrow this money and to pay back our debts, to service our debt. If inflation really does take its toll. So we have to be very mindful that we've borrowed a huge amount of money, hundreds of billions worth. We have to be more fiscally responsible going into the future. And if we are, say, to keep the universal credit uplift, does that mean we want to roll back the money that we've just pledged to health and social care? Does that mean that's going to come out of transport projects? Where's the money going to come from? How are you going to raise it? These are questions that have to be asked outside of the context of COVID.
Well, I'm just going to get Richard as well. How will it be paid for? Labour have made it clear they want to keep the universal credit increase, probably making it permanent, voted against the national insurance hikes to pay for the NHS, the pandemic recovery, without stating an alternative plan to pay for it. Richard, you have, let me just show everybody this tweet. If we put a 10% tax on the wealth of those with over £500 million, we would raise £48 billion. That would be enough to pay for 107 new hospitals. It's time to tax the super rich.
Eminently reasonable, which is why the public support a progressive taxation system. That, of course, is only one option, a one-off wealth tax, for example. But I also put down an amendment in Parliament in relation to a 1.5% tax on everyone with assets of over £5 million. And that also would have raised far more money than the government's regressive national insurance hike.
Right.
So,
how many people, by the way, have got assets of 500 million?
It's 1% of the UK population.
How do you know that? I mean, the reason why Dennis Healey, who occupied your seat, decided not to progress with the wealth tax and why lots of other countries have abandoned them is because it's very difficult to measure people's assets. How do you measure a company that's not on the stock market, for example? Is the government going to start valuing everything and issuing a tax on every piece of wealth? My view is that the answer to the question, where does the money come from, has got to be economic growth. In 1950 compared to now, we spend 7 times as much money on all the things that we like, education, health, benefits, because we've grown as an economy, and that is by far a more powerful thing than trying to basically tax ourselves into a situation where we can't grow.
Well, under the government's plans, it's working people that are going to be paying the cost of this tax hike. So if we're saying as a society that it's impossible to collect tax off the super rich, and so therefore we've got to stick the boot into working people, that's not the kind of society that we want. 14,000 families in my constituency are going to be hit by the £20 cut to universal credit. 2/3 of workers with children in my constituency are going to be hit by it.
Right. I mean, Kate, you were trying to come in there. I mean, it is true that the hike in national insurance is going to hit people in work as well as employers.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be extremely painful. It's essentially jobs tax. I'm curious as to where the Conservatives' pro-growth policies are. We're hiking tax on individuals and on businesses. The government's already looking like it's going to roll back from its planning reforms to build more homes, which would have really encouraged growth. But where's the Conservatives' pro-growth agenda? I really haven't seen very much, especially since COVID. All this Build Back Better stuff seems to be more state intervention, nothing about getting the private sector going.
All right.
But on the other side, I would just very quickly say there's really bad ideas, and then there are wealth taxes. I mean, there have been so many European countries that have tried wealth taxes and rolled them back because they fundamentally don't work. You do a one-off wealth tax this year. What do you do next year? You are only eroding your own tax base and making yourself poor in the future. In order to have sustained spending from the state, you have to have a fair tax system that people can expect. And if we're running out of money, we're running out of areas to tax, we have to ask ourselves why. Maybe it's bad policies, not the fact that we need to tax the assets of the rich, which, by the way, have probably already been taxed at some point down the line.
Well,
there are many options. For example, the TUC, and I support them, supports equalising capital gains tax with income tax levels. That would raise a huge amount of money.
But what about your wealth tax? You just heard what Kate said. It might work for a year, and then what happens?
Well, that's why there are a number of proposals. One, for example, which is a 1.5% tax on all those with assets of 5 million. And, of course, adjusting income tax as well, as we proposed in the last election. But it's no surprise the Spectator tells people that it's impossible to tax the super wealthy and that we instead have to tax working class people. It's a total rotten approach.
Is there a reason why
would it matter if it's a surprise? I mean, it's still a strong argument. The question is, how are you going to measure the asset? You say assets over £5 million without any idea of the very practical problem which Kate raised and which remains that wealth taxes are very, very difficult to implement, as well as having a distorting effect because people don't just leave their assets there to be removed.
Right, I'm going to come to you in a moment because I'd like to hear these growth policies that Kate posed the question to you. But Laura, listening to this discussion, what do you think about wealth taxes? Is that something that you or your readers would be in favour of?
I mean, look, ultimately, at the end of the day, people want to know where their money's going. And I think, we shouldn't kid ourselves. This is an issue that has been around for a long time, long before COVID. I mean, we had the Prime Minister in our office telling us long before COVID that it would take at least a decade to fix the gap between the haves and the have-nots right here in Leeds. And, now we've got this levelling up department, which is regrettable. It's taken nearly 2.25 years to set up. We really need to see some tangible action, especially in the north and for cities like Leeds that have not only been disproportionately impacted by COVID, but there's also this long-standing issue about, those who are just about managing and those just about making ends meet.
Danny, on the growth policy.
Well, the Times raises that very question this morning. We're very concerned about the question of how where the government's growth is going to come from. It obviously doesn't just come from tax cuts, by the way. And also, when we talk about growth policies, we're talking about increasing the growth. There will be a trend rate of growth in any case, and that will help us to raise money for these and what we want for these things. And what we want to do is not damage that. But yeah, I think it's a reasonable question that Kate put. The government has got a lot of policies riding on economic growth without an obvious strategy for achieving greater growth.
Kate?
I mean, I'm looking forward to hearing what they are. We haven't tried to cut taxes, we're only hiking them. But if there are all these great growth policies around the corner, I'm looking forward to hearing about them. Apparently, in the next 6 weeks, we're supposed to find out how the government is going to cost its net zero agenda. That was a promise made by Number 10 that we would be finding out exactly how they plan to pay for our 2050 target. And I am, again, very curious as to what direction we're moving in, because it only seems to be more of a top-down approach from the state, very little bottom-up, grassroots growth. And as you point out yourself, we are simply not going to achieve the amount of tax revenue we need to have come in to support public services if we don't have those policies.
Right. I mean, Richard, is Keir Starmer listening to your proposals?
Well, I think he should have clearly
he should,
support for a wealth tax, and he hasn't done yet.
No.
He should do.
And is that because he doesn't think it would garner enough support in the country?
Well, all the opinion polls I've seen show that such a policy would be popular, and that's why I should be focusing on that, not these strange rule changes in relation to the Labour Party.
Right. I mean, there is a risk, isn't there, Danny, that the Conservative Party, by raising taxes and perhaps letting people who are wealthy, who have valuable assets, they're able to hold on to them, the assetocracy. I mean, is there an accusation that can be levelled at the government that they should change that?
What, that they should have a more asset-related tax strategy? I think there's a case for looking at how you can do that effectively, and I was in favour of, for example, higher rates of local government tax on some of the more expensive properties. But it's no point doing it impractically. And the problem with the wealth tax, and why, I mean, Keir Starmer might propose it and it might be popular, but just like the last time the Labour Party decided it was going to do that in power, it then got into power and decided it was impractical and didn't do that, and that's exactly what will happen with the wealth tax. In the end, this country cannot tax its way to prosperity for people and for better services. Ultimately, it has to have a reasonable level of tax to pay for the things that it's purchasing, but the route to prosperity is greater growth, and you've got to balance those two things.
I'll come back to you in just a moment. We're almost at midday, time for Prime Minister's questions, except it's not with the Prime Minister and Keir Starmer. It is, in fact, with the deputies, Dominic Raab and Angela Rayner. We will, of course, keep an eye for when that begins. It might be in just a moment. I'll just watch to see what the Speaker is doing. Otherwise, I will go back to my guest briefly. Richard, just your final word on this. Do you think this is going to actually get anywhere, your policy?
I think it needs to, because otherwise the alternative is raising less money by putting a greater burden on working people, and that's just wrong.
Thank you to all of my guests. It's Prime Minister's questions.
Deputy Prime.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been asked to reply on behalf of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. As the House will know, he's been at the UN General Assembly in New York, where he's held meetings with world leaders, in particular leaders from countries vulnerable to climate change. He's also met with President Biden for discussions on climate, COVID and international security.
Robert Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. GPs have done a brilliant job delivering the vaccination programme. They've had to work very long hours in the most challenging circumstances, and now they're having to deal with a huge COVID backlog. As a result, many of my constituents have contacted me, frustrated by how difficult it is to see their GP face-to-face. Just this week, I've been contacted by someone who's been diagnosed with cancer after being taken into hospital. Now, she said to me, and I quote, "I can't help but wonder if they'd have caught it sooner if I'd been able to see someone in person instead of trying to describe my symptoms over the phone." So can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister what the government are doing to tackle the COVID backlog and get face-to-face GP appointments back as soon as possible?
Can I thank my honourable friend? I know he's a huge champion of his local NHS. I know of the incredible work that he's done on reinstatement of breast cancer screening clinics, amongst other things. Can I join with him in thanking GPs for the heroic job they've done to see us through the pandemic? While appointment numbers have returned to pre-pandemic levels, of course, patients, the public, rightly expect to see their GP face-to-face where it's necessary, and as he'll be aware, we've provided, and the Chancellor has funded, a £36 billion package to deal with the NHS backlog, as well as pursuing our plan for social care.
We now come to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable member makes a very important point that I think across the House people are concerned about that. And I share the Deputy Leader's comments regarding the work of the GPs and our local primary care services. But, Mr. Speaker, can I begin by offering my commiserations to the Prime Minister after he flew away to the US and made absolutely zero progress on the trade deal that he promised us. And can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister, does the Deputy Prime Minister still believe that British workers are amongst the worst idlers in the world?
He is. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, can I just say to the Right Honourable Lady, for a start, I think it's excellent news that because of the engagement we've had with the US, they have immediately given us the boost to trade and businesses by reinstating travel from the UK to the US. when it comes to British workers, can I just say to her that we've got payroll employment back to levels we saw before the pandemic. We've got youth employment rising. We've got businesses advertising over 1 million jobs at a record high, and the fastest economic growth in the G7 this year.
Angela Rayner.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, still no trade deal. And those were the words, of the Deputy Prime Minister in his book, which he wrote alongside the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary and the Business Secretary. Yeah. And his actions, Mr. Speaker, speak even louder than those words, because whatever they say, their political choices have made it harder for working families to get by. So can the Deputy Prime Minister tell us how much his universal credit cut and national insurance hike will take from a worker on £18,000 a year? Say a shop worker or a travel agent.
Well, what I'd say to the Right Honourable Lady is that the UC uplift was always meant to be temporary. We've paid the wages of nearly 12 million workers through this pandemic. We are coming out with rising jobs, rising wages. We would have done none of that if we'd have taken her advice, not come out of lockdown. Labour have got no plan. Our plan is working.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, lots of words for I don't know, so let me help him. His government chose to cut the income of a worker on £18,000 a year by over £1,100. And Mr. Speaker, that's almost exactly the same as an average annual energy bill. Just as energy prices are ballooning, they've chosen to take the money that could cover a year's worth of bills out of the pockets of working people. The Deputy Prime Minister has said the solution is for people to work harder. So can he tell us how many days a worker on the minimum wage would have to work this year in order to afford a night at a luxury hotel, say in Crete?
If she wants to talk about taxes and easing the burden on the lowest paid, I'd remind her, whenever a Labour Party has gone into government, the economy has nosedived, unemployment has soared, and taxes have gone through the roof. Under this government, we cut income tax, saving every worker £1,200 each year. We've introduced and extended the national living wage, so full-time workers £4,000 better off each year. We've doubled the free childcare for working parents, worth up to £5,000 for every child every year. When Labour takes office, unemployment goes up and the economy goes down.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about the economy. He doesn't even know how much his own holiday costs. So let me tell him, a worker on the minimum wage would need to work an extra 50 days to pay for a single night at his favourite resort. Probably, Mr. Speaker, even more if the sea was open. The very same week that the government is cutting universal credit, working people face soaring energy bills. The Prime Minister has said it's just a short-term problem and we'll leave it to the market to fix. So can the Deputy Prime Minister guarantee that no one will lose their gas or energy supply or be pushed into fuel poverty this winter?
Well, the Business Secretary has made very clear that energy supplies will continue, that our #1 priority is to protect consumers. I just remind her, though, of her words. It was in The Guardian in the 11th of May, so it must be true. She said the Labour Party must stop talking down to people. Working class people don't want a handout, they want opportunities. They're getting those opportunities. Mr. Speaker, they're getting those opportunities under a Conservative government. with catch-up tutoring for over 2 million children this academic year, hundreds of thousands of jobs for young people under our Kickstart scheme, and helping over 1 million people on long-term unemployment out under the Restart scheme. She's right. Labour talks down to working people. Under the Conservatives, they get to rise up and fulfil their potential.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I notice we have a shortage of hot air this week. But just as the Prime Minister isn't here, but the Deputy Prime Minister is doing his best to shore up supplies. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? He talks about opportunities. The government have axed the Green Homes Grant, scrapped the zero carbon home standard, and lost the storage facility that held 3/4 of our gas. Their failures, Mr. Speaker, paved the way for this crisis that will hit families and businesses. And as usual, it will be the British people that will have to pay the price. So can the Deputy Prime Minister guarantee that none of the workers employed by the energy companies will end up unemployed because of his government's failures?
What can I say to the right honourable lady? There's no shortage of hot air on that side of the benches. The Business Secretary's been absolutely crystal clear. We're seeing the challenge of wholesale gas prices rise all over the world. We will maintain supply this year. The Business Secretary has taken targeted action to support the 2 critical CO2 plants to make sure that not only do we see energy supplies through, but also food distribution. The reality is, for all her cheap political barbs, they have got no plan on that side of the House. If we'd have listened to the Labour Party, we wouldn't have opened up, we wouldn't be bouncing back, jobs wouldn't be rising, and wages wouldn't be rising.
Mr. Speaker, maybe he should go back to his sun lounger and let me take over. Because the truth is, Mr. Speaker, they were warned about the problems that we faced and the energy crisis that we faced. And there we have it, absolutely nothing to help the people up and down the country who are working themselves to the ground and still struggling to make ends meet. This is a Conservative party that does not care about working people. Families, Mr. Speaker, across the country are worried about heating their homes while he's complaining about having to share his 115-room taxpayer-funded mansion with the Foreign Secretary. Just as, Mr. Speaker, just as the truth hurts, doesn't it? Just as his government are making choices that are making working families' lives harder. A typical family, Mr. Speaker, are facing a tough winter this year. Universal credit down £1,000, rent up £150, gas bills up £150, taxes up and food prices are soaring. Working people will have to choose whether to feed their kids or heat their homes. The choice for the Deputy Prime Minister is, will he make their lives easier or harder? So what will he choose, Mr. Speaker? Will the government cancel the universal credit cut?
Can I say to the right honourable lady, she should check her facts, because Chevening is funded via a charity, not a penny of taxpayers' money. Let me also tell her the most disastrous thing for energy bills of hard-working people across this country would be to follow Labour's plan to nationalise the energy companies, which the CBI say would cost as much as £2,000 on bills. Mr. Speaker, this government's the one taking action to take the country forward with a plan for the NHS, a plan for COVID, and our plan is working. Employment up, job vacancies up, wages up. If we'd have listened to the party opposite, we would never have come out of lockdown. We're the ones taking the difficult decisions, getting on with the job, and our plan is working.
Thank you. you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, members of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme from across this House attended our excellent Defence Academy. And what is striking is the number of services personnel from overseas who come to the UK to benefit from its world-class professional defence and security education. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that this is a further illustration that, far from being a fifth wheel on the carriage, the UK is at the heart of ensuring global security, that the AUKUS Pact is one of the best ways to meet emerging threats, particularly in the South China Sea?
My honourable friend is absolutely bang on. The AUKUS partnership is incredibly important for our security. It builds on what we said in the integrated review about promoting stability in the Indo-Pacific. It builds on our FTA negotiations, including CPTPP. It builds on our membership as a dialogue partner of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the first new member in over 20 years, and it will have huge opportunities for jobs and businesses here at home, and part of the levelling up agenda.
Deputy Leader of the SNP, Kirsty Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Across Scotland and the UK, millions of families are seeing their incomes slashed by this Tory government, with a toxic combination of Tory cuts, tax rises and the growing cost of Brexit. The Prime Minister promised that he would make energy bills more than £60 per household cheaper after Brexit. Instead, they could skyrocket by £550 at the worst possible time. The UK government is slashing universal credit by £1,040, furlough is ending prematurely, and a Tory tax hike will leave the majority of families hundreds of pounds worse off next year. Right. Let's be clear, this is a Tory cost of living crisis, and yet again lower and middle income families will suffer the most. So will the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me it is time to scrap Tory cuts to universal credit and to introduce an emergency energy payment for lower income families, so no one has to choose between heating and eating this winter?
Can I just say to the Honourable Lady, many of those issues are devolved to Scotland, but the price gap, the energy price gap, the energy price gap will save 15 million households up to £100 each year. We're also taking targeted measures to extend the warm home discount. That will be £150 knocked off the bills of 780,000 homes. We're providing seasonal cold weather payments to eligible claimants, an extra £25 a week during colder periods. On top of that, we're giving a winter fuel payment to recipients of the state pension. But the crucial thing, Mr. Speaker, is that we've got rising employment and rising wages, and that will benefit everyone in Scotland and across the UK.
Kirsty Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that's a disappointing and perplexing response from the Deputy Prime Minister, who perhaps needs to go back and look again. And I have to say to him, warm words don't heat homes. And unless these Tory cuts are reversed, we will see even more families pushed into hardship and crisis. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I met with the East Renfrewshire Citizens Advice Bureau. They warned of a cost of living tsunami hammering families. A universal credit cut, Tory tax hikes, soaring household bills. Because of this government's choices, people are having to choose between heating their homes or feeding their families. For all their empty rhetoric, you can't level up by making people poorer. So can the Deputy Prime Minister explain why he's stubbornly refusing to consider introducing an emergency energy payment that would help families through a very difficult winter?
Well, as said, Mr. Speaker, the price gap in place will save 50 million households up to £100 each year. On top of that, because of the approach we've taken with the national living wage, full-time workers will be £4,000 per year better off. But can I just also say to her, I think given the challenges that we understandably face, people expect, including in Scotland, for us to come together, stop this scaremongering, stop this sowing of division, and that's why I would have thought she would welcome the fact, with some of the challenges that the Scottish Ambulance Service is facing, that we've got the British Armed Forces helping the people of Scotland.
Chris Loader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The bus and train operator First Group continue to slash our transport services in West Dorset, despite receiving millions of pounds of public money with no revenue risk at all, and the worst rail line frequency in the country on the Heart of Wessex line. will the Deputy Prime Minister directly intervene to save what little service we have on that 3-hourly frequency line, or will he actively work to get a new operator that will?
Can I thank my honourable friend, and I know he's a great champion for the people in his constituency. I also understand that the Department for Transport has been engaging with the transport operators in his constituency. I understand that South Western Rail intend to increase service levels to their pre-COVID timetable by May 2022. And I also know that they have ambitions for an increase in the train service frequency on the Great Western Rail route. DfT will, of course, continue to work with GWR, and I continue to support him in trying to champion commuters and passengers on all of those services.
Stephen Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Without a Green New Deal, the government is struggling to meet its carbon reduction targets under the Paris Agreement. At the same time, the International Energy Agency is making clear there shouldn't be any new exploitation of oil or gas fields if the world is to meet the 2050 target for carbon neutrality. Yet the government is potentially investing in the new Cambo oil field in the North Sea, and also supporting other oil wells across the UK. So how can the government have any credibility when it said and made a pledge to cease funding oil and gas companies, yet this is still going ahead?
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman, thank him for his question. Of course, we launched the landmark North Sea transition deal to transform the offshore oil and gas sector in preparation for net zero, so we have a plan. We've also secured record investment in wind power, totalling close to £500 million. We've got a world-leading hydrogen strategy, and of course we're the first major economy in the world to set net zero into law. And I can tell the honourable gentleman that on Monday at the UN General Assembly, the Prime Minister announced £550 million of ODA that will be allocated to support developing countries to meet net zero. We're leading by example at home and abroad.
Andy Carter.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, Warrington is one of the fastest growing towns in the north of England. But our hospital, which is mostly Victorian, is creaking at the seams. Over the last year, the hospital have recruited an additional 240 new nurses and more than 100 doctors. But we need more beds. So can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister to speak to the Health Secretary and ask him to back our bid for a new hospital in Warrington?
Can I thank my honourable friend? He's a powerful champion for patients and his constituents. We've now received applications for to be one of the next 8 hospitals in our new hospital programme. I understand that an expression of interest has been submitted by proposing developments across both the Warrington and Halton Hospital. I can't, and he'll understand, notwithstanding the smart way that he's gone about his intervention, I can't comment on particular applications, but I can tell him there'll be a decision by the spring of 2022.
Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I start, Mr. Speaker, as our Westminster COP26 spokesperson, by welcoming today's announcement by INEOS of £1 billion of investment into cutting greenhouse gas emissions at its Grangemouth plant and supporting the CCUS Acorn cluster at St Fergus in Aberdeenshire. A big step in the right direction. But now I must ask the Deputy Prime Minister this. Can he outline exactly for us what it is his government has against the Scottish Government requiring real living wages for Scottish workers and net zero obligations in its green ports?
Well, can I just say to the honourable lady, net zero is at the heart of everything we do, and we've raised the national living wage, which will save the full-time worker £400 every year.
John Penrose.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, later today the Subsidy Control Bill will give us all a welcome chance to replace clunky and bureaucratic EU-derived laws with faster, simpler and more flexible UK rules instead. But would the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that subsidies need strong controls so they aren't misused by, heaven forbid, a future Labour government? Ministers have already committed to make the UK world leader in subsidy transparency. So will he look carefully at proposals to publish details of more subsidies in future rather than fewer, as the current bill suggests?
Can I thank my honourable friend? He'll know, of course, that today the House will be discussing our landmark subsidy control bill, which will allow us to seize the opportunities having left the EU. Our new control system will provide quicker and more flexible support to British businesses. But he's right with what he said about transparency, and decisions on subsidies that were previously subject to approval by unelected EU bureaucrats will now be decided subject to the scrutiny and the rigour of honourable members on both sides across this House, and that will give us the transparency but also the accountability that he wants.
British Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, I've known the honourable gentleman for some time and always got on quite well with him. He represents one of the wealthiest constituencies in the country. Can you assure me that he still believes in the redistribution of income in our country? Does he really believe in levelling up? And if he does, will he make sure that Channel 4 stays in Leeds, stays in the public sector, because it's essential in the growth of our tech economy in the north of England?
Mr. Speaker, we put the UK Infrastructure Bank in Leeds because we love Leeds. And can I just say, he asks about inequality and levelling up. The levelling up agenda will, of course, help those in the Midlands, those in the North, but it will also help those in London and the South East by easing the pressure on the economy, by easing the pressure on tax revenues, and by easing the pressure on planning.
Chris Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government says that to protect the most vulnerable, it is compelling care workers to be vaccinated against COVID-19, even though this is expected to force out 40,000 carers who have been on the front line throughout the pandemic. Would my right honourable friend set out why the same approach isn't being taken to protect the most vulnerable in the National Health Service?
Can I thank our honourable friend? Look, we're very clear. Vaccines are saving lives. They're also boosting the economy because they've allowed us to open up. That's particularly important for the risk to vulnerable people, including carers in care homes. Over 90% of care home staff have received their first dose ahead of the November deadline. We encourage others to get vaccinated, and of course the DHSC is currently considering whether to make vaccination of not just COVID but also flu a condition of deployment for frontline workers in health but also in care settings.
Tricia Gibson.
In employers' national insurance payments will place a huge burden on the public sector, from local government to police and fire services. Can the Deputy Prime Minister tell the House what the financial impact of this will be, both north and south of the border, and if additional funding will be provided to ensure there are no cuts to our vital public services?
Well, can I just say to the Honourable Lady that, of course, the Treasury assessed very carefully these measures. We're supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs for young people under our Kickstart scheme. There's a range of other measures that we're taking, including the Restart scheme, and of course we look at the tax burden. But I would just remind her that we're the ones that have taken 1,200. We're the ones that have saved the average worker £1,200 every year. We've doubled the free childcare for working parents, and frankly, to the Honourable Lady, we're of course mindful of the pressure on public service as with the private sector. We're doing everything we can. But the SNP opposed coming out of lockdown. The SNP opposed.
Order! Please, we've got to try and get through some questions. It's your own side. You're stopping asking the questions, Deputy Prime Minister. Too long an answer. Deanna Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Much of the reason that I stand in this chamber today follows a chain reaction of events following the death of my father from a single punch assault. But my dad is just one of many victims, which is why this week we are marking One Punch Awareness Week. So can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister if he'll join me in showing his support for One Punch Awareness Week, and can I extend an invitation to him to join me immediately after PMQs in Westminster Hall, and indeed all colleagues right across the House to join us to show that support?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I know how much this campaign means to her personally. I know that honourable members across the House will be very proud of the tenacious way she is pursuing that campaign. Of course I will join her in Westminster Hall, and I would encourage all honourable members to do the same.
Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Following the ill-informed and partisan comments from President Biden overnight, would the Deputy Prime Minister urge the Prime Minister to point out to those he meets in the US who actually care about political stability in Northern Ireland that far from defending the Belfast Agreement, the Northern Ireland Protocol is now the single greatest danger to the political institutions? Mr. Speaker, the situation is now time critical. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that a solution that restores Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom's internal markets is the only way to avert the collapse of the institutions, and such a solution must be found in weeks rather than months?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? We absolutely agree that having a smart and pragmatic approach is the only way that we will be able to uphold the Good Friday Agreement for all communities in Northern Ireland. And notwithstanding what the reporting has said, I know, having been in Carbis Bay with the Prime Minister and with the President, that he understands our view, and we've explained our position, as well as them taking into account what the EU has said.
Jesse Norman.
Mr. Speaker, the House will know that the River Wye is one of the most beautiful rivers in our country and also a priceless national asset, yet it is being threatened by phosphate pollution. Will my right honourable friend press colleagues in the government and in number 10 to work with us to push the agencies and other interested bodies to a long-term integrated plan to clean up the River Wye?
Can I thank the Honourable Friend? Of course, the government understands, and he champions eloquently the importance of the River Wye. We'll do everything we can to support him with preserving it for future generations.
Margaret Farrier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With less than 100 days until Christmas, many of our constituents will be choosing to shop for children's toys online. There have unfortunately been incidents of young children swallowing small parts like batteries and magnets, which require invasive medical intervention. With rogue traders out there, Deputy Prime Minister, how can consumers be satisfied that toys they purchase via online marketplaces are safe, marked as age appropriate and meet the required safety standards?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? And I've got young children, and I know what it's like at Christmas, and as well as being a time of great happiness, also a certain degree of trepidation when they go for the presents in the way she described. But I can reassure her, manufacturers and distributors must provide information on age-appropriate use of toys. The UK Office for Product Safety and Standards will take action to remove products online that pose any risk, and our product safety framework is being reviewed to make sure that it's fit for purpose, that it's updated in line with new products going onto the market, and above all, that it protects consumers.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you very much. Stoke-on-Trent has received so far £29 million to the Transforming Cities Fund, 550 jobs from the Home Office, and Kids Growth has received a £17.6 million town deal. After 70 years of neglect from the Labour Party, Stoke-on-Trent is firmly on the map, but we have a £73.5 million Levelling Up Fund bid. So will my right honourable friend ensure that Stoke-on-Trent, who is now hungry, gets its just dessert?
He's a Doughty champion for his constituency. He's absolutely right. We'll give him all the support we can. And he's right to say the only reason that we're seeing that level of prosperity is because we've got employment rising, youth unemployment coming up, and rising wages. That's happening under this government because the opposition have no plan whatsoever.
But it's nice to welcome back Sir George Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I take this opportunity to thank you personally for the kindness you showed during my recent illness. Does the right honourable gentleman agree that town halls know better than Whitehall when it comes to levelling up? And will he pass on my suggestion to the Prime Minister that he hosts a cross-party summit in Downing Street with local government leaders and mayors to discuss how they can be empowered to unlock that potential?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? Whatever our differences, it's fantastic to see him back in the chamber, contributing, holding the government to account. I think the agenda for levelling up has got to involve a team effort, central government, local authorities, and the many metro mayors across the country. So I support the spirit of what he said, and we'll do everything we can to work with him.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Stroud, the Nailsworth Climate Area Action Network held a well-attended retrofit fair to help people learn about the benefits of insulating homes and the options available. Will my right honourable friend congratulate the group on the constructive approach to this difficult issue and provide the House with the confidence that the government is making even more creating even more solutions for energy-efficient homes, and let us know when there'll be more details of that work.
Can I thank my honourable friend, support all of the efforts at the local level that she's pursuing. We're backing that up at the national level, requiring all new build homes by 2025 to have low carbon heating and world-leading levels of energy efficiency. That's on top of the investment, the record investment in wind power, on top of being producing a world-leading hydrogen strategy, and also bringing the world together, because it's going to require an international solution at the COP26 Global Climate Summit in November.
Rachel Hopkins.
Mr. Speaker, 239 jobs at the Vauxhall plant in Luton South are at risk this week due to the semiconductor chip shortage and furlough ending this month. The government has failed to safeguard jobs, failed to maintain key strategic supply lines, and failed to support the UK's capability in areas such as silicon. So will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to me what Number 10 is going to do to ensure the UK automotive sector remains competitive globally and skilled jobs in towns like mine, Luton, are saved?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady, I don't think it's quite right to say the government hasn't been supporting workers. We paid the wages of nearly 12 million workers throughout this pandemic. Clearly that can't continue indefinitely, but I can reassure her specifically that the government is investing in supporting gigafactories, and we will be investing in the technologies of the future that will create the jobs of the future in her constituency and right across the UK.
Derek Thomas.
All of us here enjoy the opportunity to eat British food and drink and enjoy British flowers. I'm joined by all of Cornwall's MPs pressing the Home Secretary to renew the seasonal agricultural worker scheme for next year, 30,000 people, but also to allow them to pick daffodils. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please speak to the Home Secretary to remind her of the urgency of getting the seasonal agricultural worker scheme renewed? Thank you.
My honourable friend is a powerful champion for his constituency in the region. I will, of course, pass on his suggestion and advice to the Home Secretary. I believe she's been lobbied from various other quarters. We're very mindful of the impact on seasonal workers, and we'll make sure we get the right balance.
Final question, Anna McMorran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A former junior minister for courts and justice once told this House he was absolutely committed to doing everything he could to improve the treatment of victims in the justice system. 6 years and 3 manifesto commitments later, we're still waiting for them to deliver a promised victims bill. That junior minister is now the 6th Justice Secretary. So will he commit here today to delivering that long overdue victims bill and bring justice to millions of victims across the country, including my own constituent who was left homeless, jobless and traumatised through the court system?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I can absolutely make that commitment. I can tell her on day one I looked at the plans and expedited the work that we're doing on it. Well, if she'd give me a chance, I've not been in the job a full week. But what I can also tell her, what we're doing right now with the victims, the Women and Girls Victim Strategy that we published in July, we've provided a national police lead that reports directly to the Home Secretary. We've invested 30 million in making streets safer at night, particularly important for women, so that they have that reassurance they need, that there are no-go areas, that there are no de facto curfews. And we've also introduced 24/7 rape and sexual assault helplines. Can I just also gently say to her that in terms of standing up for the victims of crime, I lament the fact that the Labour Party voted against our police crime sentencing courts bill requiring all violent offenders, all rapists, all child rapists to serve at least 2/3 of the sentence behind bars. You can't stand up for victims unless you stand up for tough sentencing.
Right, that is the end of questions.
Well, you just heard the Speaker there. That is the end of this week's Prime Minister's Questions. It had a different feel, of course, because the deputies were standing across the dispatch box. Angela Rayner, Deputy Leader for Labour, and the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab. Let's welcome our guests for this part of the programme. Paul Scully is a business minister in the government. Thangam Debonair, Labour MP and Shadow Leader of the House. Welcome to both of you. And our very own Adam Fleming, the BBC's chief political correspondent. I said it had a different feel. It did feel a bit more sort of theatrical and upbeat and lively.
Well, yeah, and also that's partly down to Angela Rayner's presentational style in the House of Commons. She's much funnier than Keir Starmer, let's be honest. I just hope Dominic Raab had a good time on his holiday in Crete, because that holiday is going to potentially follow him around for the entire rest of his political career.
It definitely was a feature, wasn't it, through those questions from Angela Rayner. Now, of course, the serious stuff came in her questions about cost of living, and that is where the real battle lines are being drawn.
Yeah, and actually we're getting quite used to these battle lines now, because we've been hearing them a lot this week. You get Labour talking about the increase in energy bills because the energy price cap is going up as a result of the wholesale prices. You've got the removal of the £20 a week universal credit from next month at the same time. And then from next April, you've got the increase in national insurance to pay for health and social care levy. Labour bundling that all together, saying there's going to be a cost of living crisis. The government responding saying, well, no, we're protecting you with the energy price cap, even though it's going up. When it comes to jobs and wages, the economy is booming for some people. Now, both those things are actually true at the same time, but by the end of the winter, one of the narratives will have won out.
Right, well, let's talk about cost of living. Paul Scully, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, a think tank you know, which focuses on tackling poverty, calculate that a low-income couple with 2 children, where one adult works full-time, will need an additional £31 a week to cover the cost of living and falling benefit rates from October. Do you accept that?
Well, that's the findings that they've come up with. I haven't seen the recommendation, but clearly what we're trying to do is we're trying to tackle this head on. We've seen Angela Rayner coming up with some knockabout fun, which is interesting for the politicos that watch PMQs, but without any real solutions. So what we've got is the energy price cap that you talk about, which is still reducing the potential bills for many millions of households
but it is going to go up
by £100.
Can I just focus though on that £31 a week extras? You do accept people will be worse off.
This is what we're trying to do, is to make sure, first of all, that's based on a single set of principles. What we've got is a record amount of vacancies. We clearly need to encourage people that are not in work into work, and matching up with those vacancies. Those people that are in work, we want to encourage and find more ways of allowing them to work more hours as well, which in balance, in the round, will therefore come up with a better deal for those, especially the lowest paid. We're continuing with our manifesto commitment to increase the national minimum wage, and we've seen a wage increase as well. All of these factors will help mitigate the
We'll come on to the wage increases in just a moment, but given that you admit there are pressures on the cost of living caused by the things we've just talked about, gas prices, labour shortages in certain industries, inflation and so on, is it sensible? Do you think it's justifiable to be taking away that £20 a week increase in universal credit for families on low incomes?
It's about £6 billion. It was a temporary measure, an emergency measure, and it served its purpose to be able to support people through that 18 months of difficult times. But the alternative, again, we haven't heard any options from the Labour Party, would to be put the equivalent of 1 penny on income tax, 3 pence on fuel duty as well. So that again, these things have to be paid for. We've got to get that balance right, and we're trying to do it in the round with getting people into work, but also working more hours and raising their wages.
All right, let's get Thangam to respond. I mean, Labour says it wouldn't be cutting universal credit at this time, so we can probably assume that you would keep that £20 increase a week in perpetuity. That would add something like £5 to £6 billion a year to the welfare bill. Now, the public does know, Thangam, that the money has to be found from somewhere, either from taxation or increased borrowing or cutting expenditure elsewhere. Which is it?
Well, I think the public also knows that when working families have less to spend in their local economy, less money goes into the local economy. That also has an economic consequence, and that's the situation we're in now. Paul there seems to be quite content to accept that there is a cost of living crisis without any solutions. We think they should, at the very least, protect the universal credit £20 uplift, and it's just not realistic to say that has no impact. It's having an impact right now. The government was warned about the heating crisis. They were warned about the impact of cutting universal universal credit. The childcare costs are going up, council tax is going up. Why starve working families of money which would actually help our economic recovery, would actually help the economy as a whole, and that would allow us to be able to grow the economy, to do more training and to expand all the things that Paul says he wants. Where's the money going to come from if ordinary working people are starved of the opportunity to pay their bills and feed their children?
Paul?
Well, I just asked where the money's coming from. She hasn't. Thangham hasn't explained where the £6 billion is going to come from to keep that in perpetuity, as you say. But what you then do, because we know historically Labour put up taxes, and if you do put up a penny on income tax, if you put up the 3 pence on fuel duty, then actually that takes away that benefit that you see in the first place. So you're giving with one hand, you're taking with the other hand.
Right, well, what is your plan? What is the alternative?
Well, with respect, I mean, the government is about making choices, and the government this year chose to have a stamp duty holiday, which cost billions, that benefited second homeowners and landlords. They chose to spend money on a royal yacht. They've chosen to spend money on useless PPE during the pandemic, PPE that didn't work. They've made those choices, and working people are now paying the price. We could extend the Warm Homes Grant. That would help people just get through the winter. And Paul needs to accept that if working people don't have enough money to be able to pay for childcare, you can't just tell them to work more hours. Where are they going to get the childcare for that? And they're already 2-3 jobs in my constituency, people on low incomes. Where are they supposed to work those extra hours? When exactly?
All right,
and that's not helping them put food on the table.
Let me get Paul to answer that specifically in terms of trying to get extra hours. And then I still want to hear from you, Thangham, about Labour's plan as Her Majesty's loyal opposition in terms of not just criticising what the government's put forward, but what are your concrete plans being put forward to pay for the sort of spending that's been outlined by the Labour Party?
Well, first of all, we wouldn't be spending money on that yacht. Second of all, we wouldn't be spending money on that not have spent money on the stamp duty holiday. And third of all, we'll be making sure that it's working people who have the money they need, because they tend to spend money in their own local economy, which actually makes the economy go further.
That might give you several million. That might give you several million, but this is $5 billion a year on the welfare bill. Where would you find
into the economy? This is for working people, Jo. This is so that working people have then got the money to spend on their heating bills, which is pretty basic, to be able to pay for childcare so that they can go out to work, contribute more in taxes and have more money to spend in the local economy.
So when are
That's
we going to hear your tax?
An economy. You can't grow an economy if the economy is shrinking because people don't have enough money to spend on the basics.
All right, so we can assume we're not going to hear your tax policies at the moment. Maybe the opposition doesn't have to do that at this point, but you are going to continue to outline your spending policies.
Now, I've already suggested ways in which we could cut from elsewhere, which the Tory government has chosen to ignore. They chose to put money into a stamp duty holiday, which didn't need to happen, and as I said, benefited people who didn't need it. We would put money into the hands of ordinary working people. These are people who have 2-3 jobs already. There is no spare hours for them to work. If you starve them of money, they can't pay for childcare, they can't pay for transport to work, there are no more hours for them to work, and when they have spare money in their pocket, guess what? They spend it in the local economy, which then has a multiplier effect, and I think everybody knows that.
All right, well, let's talk about wages, because various Conservative politicians, including the Prime Minister, Paul, have said wages are rising. You said it yourself. For the first time in decades, the Prime Minister said. Is that true?
Well, certainly wages are rising. I mean, we've seen that.
Are they rising for the first time in decades, as Boris Johnson said?
Well, certainly to the extent that they are rising at the moment, significantly rising. They're going up quite significantly over the last few months. You can see what's happening.
Right, over the last few months is different to the first time in decades, because the short answer is actually no, according to Robert Cuff, the BBC head of statistics, and I trust him. Wages are rising, but not for the first time in decades. And they've been rising and rising faster than the cost of living most of the time since 2014. But a good chunk of that growth is a statistical fluke. It's because wages this time last year were artificially low, think lockdown and furlough, rather than because this year's wages are incredibly high. So do you want to correct the record on behalf of the Prime Minister?
I'm not going to correct the Prime Minister, but what I would say, it's fair to say that the wages were low last year. It's fair to say, though, that the wages at the moment are increasing, not just because of that statistical anomaly, but also because of businesses recalibrating what they have to pay market value for people in hospitality, in HGV drivers, in warehouse workers. We can see those hourly rates going up. But just to go back very quickly to those tax suggestions that Thangham was talking about, they're all the three that she came up with were singular events. You talked about the key was what you said was £6 billion a year. A yacht is a single purchase. It's not going to, we don't buy a yacht every year. That's just, that's not going to be nowhere near what's needed to actually reverse that change.
Well, isn't it interesting that the wage statistics can't be trusted when it comes to the triple lock on state pension, but they can be trusted when it comes to arguing with Labour?
What are you trying to say, Adam?
Well, what I'm saying, I'm just saying, look, I've spoken to 6,000 businesses or so over the last year. I just hear, I'm reporting what I'm hearing back from businesses who are saying that they are having to increase wages to get the people in, despite that there's a record amount of vacancies. Yeah. They're not finding people in. And that's where those hours are going to be for people. But I'm not telling people to work more hours. We just want to make sure that we can work with people to encourage them to work more hours and match that up better.
On people's energy bills, so the Warm Homes discount, which is currently worth £140 a year, next winter is going to go up to £150 a year. Would you like to bring forward that increase to this winter?
Well, we'll look at that. But the price cap in itself is still saving £100 per household for I think it's 5 million households. So it's still doing its job. It's still reducing.
Well, no, it's saving £100 from an imaginary price that you would never. That
well,
you don't experience.
I'm not sure it's an imaginary price, but I'm not sure it's an imaginary price. But what we've got to look at, is the. It's difficult to predict what's going to happen with spot prices, with wholesale prices. This is something that we've got to plan for the worst. Clearly, as a government, that's what any responsible government would do. But but we are working with supply as well as demand, as well as that cap.
Well, if any responsible government would look to the future, then a responsible government would have taken notice of Rachel Reeves when she was chair of the Base Select Committee 2 or 3 years ago and warned the government about gas storage. A responsible government would then have looked at the fact that last winter it was cold and more people were at home spending more on heating. So there was going to be a gas crisis. A responsible government would be thinking about what's going to happen this winter. And the Prime Minister just saying, "Oh, Christmas isn't cancelled." Look where that got us last winter.
But this is a global situation. It's all to do also with LNG demands in.
Hang on. Let him respond.
But it's also to do with demand in Asia and liquefied natural gas.
That didn't cancel your green homes.
So we have 50% or nearly 50% domestically sourced energy. We've got another 30% coming from Norway, and that's why we can say in good confidence that there's going to be no energy shortage. But what we do need to tackle is the prices that Adam was raising.
All right. Well, Thangham mentioned the Business Select Committee. I think she did at least, or certainly the Business Department. And we can hear evidence being given by Ofgem about energy prices.
We have seen exit from this market before. We've had, up to double-digit numbers of companies exit the market over time. So it's not unusual for suppliers to go out of the market. I think what's different this time is that dramatic change in the costs that those suppliers are facing. So we've had around we've had 5 roughly over the past few months. We've had a number more at the start of the year. We do expect more. We do expect more to face not to be able to face the circumstances we're in. But it's genuinely hard to say more than that, partly because that means predicting what may happen to the gas price. So all I want to say here is this is a significant impact on the sector.
Right, well, it looks like, certainly according to Ofgem, that more companies are going to go to the wall. That means more customers being taken over by the bigger customers, and that probably means higher prices.
Well, there's a systems issue and a customers issue here. So the issue for the system is it can cope with a handful of suppliers going bust and their customers being transferred to other people. Can it cope with loads of companies going bust at the same time? The government's not totally convinced that it can, so they're looking at shoring that up. And then the customer problem is that if you're on a really sweet deal with the new energy company that goes bust, you get transferred to a more legacy energy company, they might be charging you more.
We're going to talk about something else. I'm just going to show everyone this headline in the Daily Mail. It says, that's Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, I'll lock up the eco mob. She's talking about the campaign group against climate change, Insulate Britain. We've shown you this story over the last few days about the protests on the M25. A court injunction has been granted to National Highways, meaning similar demonstrations could lead to imprisonment, I should say. Insulate Britain have tweeted, the government is reckless and is putting lives at risk with its inaction on insulation at Grant Shapps, the Transport Minister. How many lives have been lost already due to poorly insulated, leaky homes? How many will be lost because of climate collapse? Get on with the job. First of all, Thangham, do you support the government's efforts to crack down on these climate protesters?
Well, I certainly don't condone or support the sort of dangerous demonstration where people are putting themselves and others potentially at risk on motorways. I think the police have done a really difficult job. However, The problem we've got is uninsulated homes. The government's utter woeful failure with its own Green Homes grant just under a year ago is part of that problem. The government needs to see that 14% of our carbon emissions comes from housing, and if we're really going to get to net zero, they need to escalate, not halt, their insulation. They need to make sure that they're putting that investment in renewable energy, which they failed to do. They could have done with not cancelling Labour's net zero housing policy, which they cancelled in 2015. There's all manner of things which they could be doing. I think that that's what the government needs to be primarily focused on, is actually getting homes insulated and warm. That would also help with the gas crisis, let's face it. If people are spending less on heating the sky, then we will need less fuel. They should be doing that both from a climate change point of view and from a cost of living point of view.
Right, do you accept the aims of Insulate Britain? I know you won't support the protests themselves, or certainly the manner in which they're being carried out, Paul, but concentrate on the substance here in terms of the lack of insulation in so many homes.
Yeah, look, I mean, retrofitting and working on homes is very important. The only way we're going to be able to get to our 2050 net zero ambitions is if businesses, small and large, if governments, national, local, regional, and communities and individuals all do their bit, all work together on this. I mean, but coming back to the what Priti Patel was saying, I heard an interview this morning with the one of the spokesmen for the protest group saying that they had safety in their mind. I don't believe that for a second. They might do when they've got 16 tons of steel coming up, bearing down on the M25. But what did they do when they actually had that person that, for example, that had a stroke and that's paralysed as a result? All of the other people that they're putting at risk, the police that they're putting at risk as well, that are trying to take them off the roads. I think it's ridiculous to say that. There are ways of tackling this. We can't do everything tomorrow, which is why the 2050 net zero target is the first in its kind to be legislated for, is a realistic target to deliver net zero.
So what is it? So what action? But what action is being taken? Specific action in terms of improving insulation of homes.
So, well, as I say, we've worked our way through the Green Homes grant for the people that apply for it, and we're continuing to do so. We will continue to look at ways of retrofitting and insulating as well. We've also got the
so action isn't going on right at the moment.
We've also got the requirements, as you heard from the Deputy Prime Minister in questions as well, about the requirements on new build homes by 2025, about the energy efficiency of those. So there's plenty happening, all wrapped up within the Prime Minister's 10-point plan.
All right. I mean, Thangham, in its drive for net zero, one of the big things, as you know, the government wants to do is for all of us to get rid of our gas boilers over time. Now, that could start, though, in a few years' time. You've just talked about the problems of the cost of living. Many homeowners, I'm sure you will agree, will worry that they're being asked to replace their boilers with expensive air source heat pumps or other costly ways of heating their homes. So, what are you suggesting happens?
Well, this again is where we've got a government failure. I mean, I'm very confused as to Paul mentioning that the Green Homes grant is being worked through. The government ended it earlier this year, so that's not happening.
It's the people that have committed to it, the people that applied,
we should be insulating our homes,
to it.
And the fact that the market in air source and ground source heat pumps isn't working yet, and I do understand that it's a very expensive job to do if you are trying to do it as an individual, shows exactly why the government needs to be choosing where it invests, investing in the sort of high-skilled, high-tech jobs of the future, which include fitting those air source heat pumps that we're going to need, making sure that we've got the manufacturing pipeline working. That's exactly what the government should be doing, and I'm not hearing anything from Paul about that. And in fact, that would actually really help the local businesses in the recovery from COVID, so that we could point in the right direction, actually stand some chance of meeting that net zero target that, frankly, Labour had to push the government to do.
Paul?
Well, as I say, with the Green Homes grant, what I was specifically saying about the people that had applied for it and making sure that they can actually get the benefits of that. But in terms of the heat source pumps and other issues that we were doing, this is why it's 2050, because we're not asking everybody to change their boiler tomorrow. This is what the media are reporting. This is what you're calling out. But it's about developing technologies, developing markets, which will then drive down costs. We can see that from electric cars. We published our hydrogen strategy recently, which already is starting to bear fruit by leveraging private investment when they have a confidence that the government is backing a particular source and therefore creating and developing new markets.
All right. All right. Well, hang on, Thangham, because I just want to talk to Adam on the sort of international scene because of the visit of Boris Johnson in the US. I'm just going to show everybody this headline story, which is China pledges to stop building new coal energy plants abroad. We mentioned it earlier on in the programme. How big a deal is this?
Oh, that's huge, because that makes a massive change to just the global ecosystem for power stations being built, because China's a huge investor and and the Western countries are stopping this kind of investment too. So it's great that President Xi has done this at the UN General Assembly. What he didn't do, though, was make a big pledge about how many greenhouse gases China will cut by 2030, which they're obliged to do under the COP26 process. People would have loved it if he'd come forward with a pledge about that.
Thangham, do you welcome the headline announcement?
Well, I mean, we've still got a way to go. I mean, but Boris Johnson actually went over to the UN intending to try and secure, I believe it was £100 billion of investment. There's a long way to go yet, but we need to escalate this. We're less than 100 days from COP26, and already people are setting their expectations far too low. We're running out of time. COP26 should have happened last year. We all know why it didn't, but that means we need to double our investment energy. And, for instance, Labour's identified £30 billion of already committed capital investment. The government's already said it's going to spend over the next few years. If they brought them in now, they'll be introduced some of that sort of high-skilled jobs that Paul said they were looking at, but obviously not doing anything about in terms of retrofitting and learning how we introduce ground and air source heat pumps quicker and cheaper.
Right, well, Paul, let's have a quick look at Greta Thunberg, the activist. Her tweet, it's quite easy to understand why the world's top emitters of CO2, carbon dioxide, and the biggest producers of fossil fuels want to make it seem like they're taking sufficient climate action with fancy speeches. The fact that they still get away with it is another matter. What would you say?
Well, I agree that that speeches are one thing and action is another. But I've talked about the hydrogen strategy, which is already delivering private investment, which will in turn drive down costs, develop new technologies, and make it far more accessible for people in their own homes, never mind industries, to be able to access this and help their own business costs come down and in turn deliver net zero.
All right, we're going to get the heat and building strategy. I've got my phone calendar open to put it in.
Oh, where is it,
As
Adam?
soon as possible.
Where is it?
As soon as possible.
You've said that all year.
We want it to come out as soon as possible.
Well, Paul, you'll tell us first, and we'll tell you, Thangham, as soon as we have it. Just very briefly, I'm going to say thank you to both of you because we're in the closing seconds. That question, the interesting question from the DUP about the ill-informed, she said, and misguided comments by President Biden when it came to Northern Ireland.
Yeah, interesting. This was in the Oval Office yesterday. President Biden didn't mention Northern Ireland or the Ireland Protocol in his opening remarks. It was only when he was asked about it, so he didn't necessarily want to bring it up himself. But yeah, one of the reasons why the US does not want to go full throttle on a trade deal with the UK is because they want to see if the UK is going to respect the Brexit deal when it comes to Northern Ireland and what the impact is on the Good Friday Agreement, which Joe Biden cares about a lot.
That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.